been my honor to spend a lot of time with them, both professionally and even personally, getting to know each other at night in a human way, right? It's amazing what you find out that you have in common across states, I'm from the States, across countries. When you look at each other and you see that human connection, there's just something different. You just instantly connect differently in a way that a text message could never connect us. So I'm glad we're having these conversations. You know, we've had a lot of great topics. This one here, you know, we've had a lot of conversations, what can be done in different individual organizations, maybe even different countries, but what can be done at a global level. Why? Because this is a global issue. Why is it a global issue? Because the globe is full of humans. Therefore, we need to have a conversation at all these different levels so that we can help as many children as possible grow up in the digital age. So the official title is Global Crisis, Global Response, Why Global Health Organizations Need to Be Paying Attention. I'd like to introduce our amazing panel here today. Starting on the end, we have Dr. Mitch Prinstein, the Chief Science Officer at the American Psychological Association, and he also works at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he directs the Winston National Center on Technology Use, which is amazing in some of the recent research that's coming out. I'm sure some of that will come to light here. We have Pranjal Sharma, an economic analyst, advisor, and author focusing on tech, globalization, and inclusive growth. Really honored to have you with us here today. Yes, Dr. Gaia Bernstein is the Technology, Privacy, and Policy Professor of Law at Seton Hall University School of Law. You're one of the few lawyers who I love hanging out with, so thank you for being here today. It's been a real pleasure. And then Dr. Jim Winston, trustee of the Winston Family Foundation. We just had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Jim and his son Hunter up here and their conversation about muddling through technology, which was really powerful. And you bring over 3 decades of clinical experience in psychology focusing on addiction, which is so valuable. So really happy to have you all with us here today. We'll save some question time at the end, so please be thinking of those as we start our discussion here today. So again, the focus here being, this isn't just I'm from Michigan. This isn't just a Michigan problem, right? This isn't just a first world problem, right? So I'd like to talk about maybe more of the global nature of addiction. What are we starting to see in countries that can measure data? What are some of the things that we're starting to see around the world as it pertains to young people and how they use their devices? And either Jim or Mitch, I think either one of you would have a lot to offer here. Mitch, why don't you start us off? Would that be okay?
Sure. So most of the research that's been done so far has been mostly in North America, but we are seeing more and more research coming from Europe, some research coming from Australia, and also from China as well.
Yeah.
So the first step is that we need far more research. You know, we need to be doing work to understand how it is that people from different cultural backgrounds, with different kinds of values, traditions, customs, are interacting with technology and experiencing things that may be very similar or may be very different from what we've learned so far in North America. What I can say from interactions with the OECD and WHO is that so far what we're hearing is remarkable similarity across many developed nations in the extent to which these devices have just captured the attention of youth and they've become, you know, really fixated on them. Of course, we have no reason to think that the effects of this on things like the brain would be any different from culture to culture as well. So some of our research on neuroscience has a global implication.
Right. I mean, physiology is physiology, right? I mean, it's a brain. So, yeah, no, thank you for that.
So,
Dr. Jim.
Just to tag that, we carry around the same hardware, all of us, neurobiologically. So the devices are designed to be hyperstimulating, overwhelming, beyond kids' capacity to regulate. So as a clinician, I'm not in the global, I'm in the singular, but it seems like the World Health Organization and other organizations need to recognize the smoke that's really in terms of the depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, and know that there's a fire there that's going to spread wherever humans are, because the susceptibility, the vulnerability of the neurobiology of adolescence is well known, and these devices are really hijacking a particular process of evolutionary protocol. And that, to me, makes perfect sense when you look at the data around the world.
Would you mind expanding? I know that not everybody has been in some of the earlier conversations, Jim. Would you mind expanding on when you say that hardwired evolutionary protocol? Like, what is so unique about devices and what they're demanding of us as humans, different from, say, other things, be it food or things? There's really something unique about devices and what they're...
So when I got into this about 9 years ago, I think the symptomatology was really very precise in terms of what was happening. I couldn't really, I wanted to try in my own way, put a piece to the puzzle, and that was that the evolutionary protocol, I mean, if you think about the conditions that 100,000 years ago where our brain really developed, they're very different, right? And survival was the primary motivation. And we needed visceral contact in terms of our attachment strategies. We're not lizards. We can't just, go our own way. We need fundamental attachment to caretakers or parents for an extended period of time to really become flourishing human beings. So from my perspective, that requires, again, the visceral, the dimensional capabilities of eye contact, voice quality, touch, those kinds of things. My worry, and I've said this before, is that kids are now spending an extraordinary amount of time connecting through a screen, 8-9 hours a day. As Mitch reported, sometimes they pick up their phones 400 times a day. Yeah. That is a pseudo kind of connection. Other people have talked about the loneliness, or they end up feeling more alone. That has dramatic consequences for how the brain is being rewired. And I would say it's sort of like, as Mitch also mentioned, candy has the sugar but no nutrients.
Right.
And I really do believe it's giving kids that sort of metaphorical sugar rush, but without any actual nutrients for that brain development. So in that way, kids are attaching through a screen, and that becomes their primary contact, not other human beings. And that's a huge worry for me as a psychologist.
Yeah.
I can say that scientifically, we do have evidence from cultures all around the world that one of the first areas of the brain that matures at approximately 10 or 11 years old is an area referred to as the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum is filled with oxytocin and dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
It evolutionarily made us interested in hanging out with our peers more than our parents. Even adolescent mice spend more time with other adolescent mice than they do with adult mice.
So I shouldn't be offended when my kids think I'm a dork and don't want to hang out with me, right?
That is evolutionarily and biologically primed. What's happened is that vulnerability has now been exploited because the desire to have 24/7 contact with peers in the form of reinforcements, kind of like a slot machine might give you reinforcements, likes, followers, notifications. That's actually really triggering that oxytocin and dopamine receptor to make us crave more of that interaction. And that, we know, is a global similarity in how brains develop around the planet.
In other words, kids are kids are kids, right? No matter where they are. And I think that's what's so important about what the two of you are sharing, is that it elevates it from culture. It elevates it from politics. It elevates it from even values and takes it to something much more objective, and that is the human level. So,
well, and to add to that, any parents in the room of adolescents know adolescents are all gas and no brake. That's and neurobiologically, the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop, and so you're giving them a hyper-stimulating device that they are incapable of regulating. And so to expect them, from my opinion, to expect them, if you sit down and say you need to learn, is no different than, in some ways, giving them cocaine with a roadmap of how to responsibly use it. I think it's beyond their capacity to regulate, because the prefrontal cortex, the brakes, don't really fully develop until early 20s. So that's another piece to this.
Yeah, thank you for that. Gaia, your specialty in the regulatory space and looking at ways that we can hopefully maybe move a little bit faster and wiser, given the speed with which these technologies are advancing and the impacts that we're seeing. Maybe even reflecting on some of the things you've heard this week, what are some of the principles of regulation that maybe could be amplified more at a global level so that we can make some of these changes happen?
Well, I think basically the idea is to try and change the way that technologies are designed. So there are certain things that could be done across the board. One of them, the same addictive designs are everywhere. They're in social networks, they're on our devices. For example, there's something called the intermittent reward model, which when we get rewards on an irregular basis, we get a boost of dopamine. So every time we get a notification on our phone, we get a boost of dopamine. Every time we get a like on Facebook, we get a boost of dopamine. These are everywhere. And I won't go into all addictive design, but basically changing the designs and getting the addictive designs out is one thing we could do. Another thing is, and that's something that tech companies have been taking advantage in order not to create change, is there's something called default settings. When you get your phones on a certain default, you're less likely to change it. Mm-hmm. We usually don't change things. Because we think that's the recommendation. Also, we don't have the time to think about everything. So even if you get, a health insurance and the default is a certain selection, you probably stay with the default.
Right.
So this is what's happening with our phones. So our phones, the default is for an unlimited amount of time. So even if we have an option of limiting the amount of time, which at a certain point some tech companies gave us for certain apps, for certain devices, we're unlikely to do that. But can you imagine if you got a phone in which the default was use the phone for 2 hours? You could change it, but you would have to think about changing it.
Right.
That would be another thing. And I think a third thing is the way our devices are configured. Our devices are configured to just have more and more and more in them. And yes, there are some phones for kids, but they're very uncool. You don't see Apple or Google coming out with regular phones for all of us, which have less, in a way that we will be able to get around with them, but we don't have to have every attraction in our hand all the time.
No, I think what you're pointing out here is an additional layer of responsibility is the thing that we hold in the first place, right? And what could be done before we move that into all other parts of the world, right? What could be done with that at the device level with manufacturers so that we're actually exporting a healthier version of it into other cultures, into other communities, so that we're not replicating some of these harms that we've already explored here. That's great. That's great insight. Pranjal, you've done writing and research into some of the impacts that emerging technologies have on society, right? What some of those impacts are, even looking ahead into the future. What are some of the things that concern you as we look not only at the globalization of technology, but what can we learn from that so that we don't replicate the mistakes if we, take action at a more global level?
Thank you. I think, again, a very serious issue, and I'm glad you began by saying this is not about Michigan, this is about the world. Remember that you have billions of new kids who are coming into adulthood, also joining the school and education ecosystem. And for several 100 million students in growth economies in Asia, Latin America, and Africa,
Right. Yeah.
a digital device is the portal for mainstream inclusion.
Right.
Right? So we have to, when we say that we have to be banning, and UNESCO may say don't ban, ban smartphones in schools, but it's not the device at fault. You have to figure out what are you doing with the device and what is the content which is available on the device. So there is a lot of nuances we need to understand. You cannot just say, well, some kid is 16 hours on the phone, you stop it. And therefore, all mobile devices for all educational institutions should not be available. That's going to be, a very blunt instrument. It's not going to serve anybody.
Right.
In an era where you're looking at economic inclusion, digital inclusion, if you look at what the World Economic Forum has just published 3 or 4 reports on digital inclusion, they have an alliance on artificial intelligence. And there was a minister from Rwanda, she spoke on how on this alliance, they are allowing kids in Africa to be able to get much smarter access to education.
Wow.
Because many of the countries cannot go the route of the Western economies of setting up brick and mortar schools in every district or every locality.
Right.
Now, if you are going to use digital infrastructure and devices to bring the most modern education systems to them, how can you go around saying that smartphones are terrible for kids? So it's not the smartphone which is at fault. What you do with it is the real issue. And I think we need to, unpack that. It's I think we need a global structure, but we need local applications, which sometimes I think gets lost.
Yeah, sure.
Because you feel, well, whatever is happening in Michigan should also happen in Malawi.
Right, right. No, and I think that's powerful. Mitch, I'll let you jump in after. You reminded me of something that a colleague that I've been spending some time with here, Phil, has said, that all of the problems, whether they're digital or other, can be solved in your community, right? So instead of always trying to apply that blunt object into a more nuanced situation, right? He's just a big fan of having that discussion at the community level to apply that principle more locally. And I think that's a really important thing, that we don't just take what works in the UK and say it'll work everywhere else. Mitch, did you want to?
I just wanted to echo Gaia's point. I think, as a global solution, the manufacturers who are creating the devices that
Absolutely.
we're talking about, can create a version of the device that allows for the benefits of, let's say, dissemination of educational opportunities, but shuts down, everything else. So my kids were issued a device at their school, but its administrator, the system administrator, controls that device. They cannot download any apps. They are not able to do anything but schoolwork on it. It's very much, and that's just using the controls we have in place now. The more elegant solution is to create, a child safety cap on the device so they can't access the parts that would harm them if used irresponsibly.
Right.
But let me add to this.
Yeah, please.
There is again a nuance here.
Yeah.
How do you tell a 10-year-old that this device is okay and this device is not okay? You're still telling kids that holding a screen, looking into it for hours and hours is absolutely fine. It's like saying you can keep eating, but you have to decide and take a decision on what you want to eat. A 10-year-old may not have the maturity to do that. So how do you tell a 10-year-old, especially in a post-COVID world, where at least 3 or 4 years, kids did not have interaction with each other, and they were severely dependent across the world,
Right.
on a digital device to remain connected with their education cycle. So while you can have these controls, I'm sure you're going to have a tough time arguing with a 10-year-old saying that, that is an okay device and that's not an okay device.
Yeah.
I think you can.
Okay.
I think we can tell a kindergartner, this pencil is useful to write with, but don't eat it. I think we can. I think that should be part of the responsibility of using a device in an educational setting, is to teach them the parameters around where it's safe and not, in the same way that we expose them to many other things. Crossing the street at school, you should only do that with a crossing guard, or there are many ways that we build a scaffolding around kids.
Right.
To help provide them with the support they need as we slowly introduce them to more and more opportunity. And I think it's our responsibility when we issue a device not to let them explore freely what they could do with it, but to in fact give them quite a lot of barriers.
Also
just
remember,
think
sorry,
that-
just to add, also remember that kids are very good at hacking.
They are. That's
It doesn't matter what kind of controls you put, you can get solutions and hacks to overcome those barriers. So you can give the device for studies, and next thing you know, they're listening to YouTube. So.
Right, but I think it's I have a different perspective on this, because I do believe that the devices are hyper-stimulating. They're designed to be that way. It's nearly a limitless supply of stimulation down one device. And my job as a parent, and I've witnessed it in my practice for years, the whole notion of boundaries, firewalls, if you will, when somebody's not able to put up a firewall themselves, that's why we send people to treatment for alcohol, to put artificial boundaries up until they can reconnect with their healthier self, if you will, to be able to go out in the world, that it's our job, and I like the idea of creating a device with firewalls in it that are age appropriate, that keeps some of the possible harmful content out, because I have a 15-year-old and I'm teaching him how to drive, which is a terrifying experience, but it's a gradual, it's my job as a parent to be responsible about not just giving him something, but recognizing his immaturity, his emotional vulnerability, and to take that seriously and not overwhelm them. That's where I think the tech companies have responsibility. I don't know the details, but to create a device that's appropriate for 6 to 10 and 10, something like that, to take that neurobiological and emotional vulnerability seriously.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, Gaia,
I
please.
just want to add two things to what was said here. So first of all, the idea that if you're under a certain age, you can only get a certain device. You cannot drive a car unless you reach a certain age. What is wrong with limiting the type of device you could use? And to the idea that, yes, kids can manipulate it. Yes, kids can manipulate lots of things. For example, drugs. You know, we have these containers for drugs that are supposed to be kid safe. There are lots of kids who could open them, but lots of kids who can't. So by making it basically prohibitive for kids to get access means that many of them won't get access and some will. But you are decreasing the numbers who do.
Yeah, no, I think.
Sorry, I think there's a lot of spaces.
Yeah,
here, so you
please,
can all come
please come
from
forward
those
and
spaces.
join us. Yes. I'm actually hearing quite a bit of agreement among these different positions in that it's not that we want to be handing children in all different countries devices that are without barriers. It's not that we want to also just hand them devices mindlessly so that they don't know what they're used for, and in their curiosity as children are constantly finding ways to hack through. I think it's that education and that conversation that is teaching them why the boundaries are there, that it's actually for their good. And I'm a big fan of whatever a child could do to get around some rule that we have in their house or some boundary that are put in place. I'm a big fan of just calling out the fact that they could get around it. But you know what? Here's why I don't want you to. And I think that's where that digital education comes in. There's a reason why we have this filter in place or this time limit in place. And it's because, amazing child, amazing student of mine, this is what we know about if we let you wander into those places or if we let you be exposed to that kind of content, it could harm you in this way. And we just don't want that to happen. I think sometimes by having those intentional, caring conversations about why we're doing certain things, we bring them into the conversation so they join us in making some of those wise choices instead of it being an us versus them with technology, which, gosh, we know they're always going to win. They're like digital ninjas. So yeah.
I think we're just focusing a lot on the hardware part of it, the device. We have to equally look at the content, right?
Absolutely.
There are the new concepts. So one of the things I've mentioned in my book is that there's a huge social pushback against technology across the world, and even the two reports released yesterday by WEF talk about responsible AI and ensuring that it is used in a constructive way. Remember, AI is going to be on devices as well.
That's right.
Right? How do they access content? I'll give you an example. Last month in December, Google has spent, I think, a few $1 million across Asia to run a campaign saying how to control the content that your tweens are using on YouTube. So that's an awareness concept. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because there's social pressure. They're facing regulations. They're facing questions saying that how can you just allow. So if you talk about gateways and filters and controls, it's not just on the device, Mitch. It has to be on the content provider as well.
Absolutely.
How do you gate the content? How do you ensure that some kind of a process is there that the content provider recognizes an adult from a non-adult? What is appropriate? I mean, that discussion is far bigger and deeper to regulate that than just the device controls, because you're very right. I mean, these are all, some of the content is meant to be addictive. there is a huge effort at a global level to counter addictive algorithms. Because simple things, even like Instagram, etc., have been known to use
Correct.
addictive algorithms, which just take you down a rabbit hole. The more you see it, the more you like it, and next thing you know, you're 2 hours down into some stupid feed. So my point is that we cannot talk about addiction without talking about content regulation and the responsibility of content creators to also put some filters and some kind of gates on it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I would,
Yes. Sorry.
Just a yes. Yes. Yeah. No. Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
I would add to that the notion of salience when it comes to neurobiological development. So that means charge, right? And our brains are, given our survival instinct, are geared to look for charge. So I would suggest that, like, violence is not designed to be addictive. But if you ever watch a kid watching violence, their eyes are wide and and so charge is going on in their brain, right? They can't help it. It activates a very primitive mechanism. My sense is that the devices, whether they're designed to be addictive or not, are hyperstimulating. The salience factor when you have a device that has a limitless supply of stimulation is overwhelming. That's the principle that I think we really need to slow down and address with kids whose neurobiology is still so incomplete, vulnerable. And again, we know that the brake system is the last part of the brain to develop.
I just wanted to say that I agree the content needs to be monitored. The people that I've talked to who work at tech companies, particularly those on social media platforms, have told me that there's not a single line of code that differentiates the experience for a child or an adolescent or an adult.
Right.
So there's nothing that is monitoring or changing the experience of the content, other than advertising, what kinds of ads, and that is a big concern. But I would go even a step further and say, in addition to the content, we have to look at the features and the functions. The like button, we know itself causes a dopamine surge.
That's content. So that's
Okay, you're calling that content. Then I agree. The like button.
The like button is not on your device. It's on the content provider's engagement feature.
Okay. Yeah, no, we're talking the same thing.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we've established, I think, some really important ideas here. One, that, evolutionary biology, right? Kids are kids, no matter where they are. They have certain tendencies with technology, no matter where they are. There are certain benefits that technology can bring to kids all over the world that we're trying to balance by not also doing them harm. Now, we've recently seen something in the COVID pandemic that was a global issue, right? It didn't matter where you lived. We found out, we all watched the map. For a little while, you felt safe in certain places because there weren't any red dots wherever you happened to live. But sooner or later, it was a global issue. And there were mobilizations that took place at a global level that caused a lot of global action very quickly. I mean, we are able to do things quickly when the right motivation is there and the right people at the right levels are saying the right things. What are some of the lessons that we could learn from that, both the positive and learning from the negative, that we might be able to apply to this? Since we've established this as a global concern, what maybe have we learned from the COVID experience that we could apply in this context?
So I'll just add one point, and I'm sure you will add to it. New regulators are coming up. There's a concept of e-safety commissioner. Some of you may know about it. Australia has set it up. The Ofcom of UK has created a division only on e-safety, which includes harm in the digital era. It includes children, but also adults and other vulnerable communities. You see a lot of new regulation coming up, and I think that's the way ahead, which mandates to ensure that both the device makers and content providers have to accept responsibility. It cannot be consumer is going to decide everything, because here the consumers are not mature enough to know what they want.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
I agree. We need laws and regulations that are going to push this global change. I think in addition, we need to have a public groundswell, a grassroots calling for these regulations, not only to motivate our lawmakers and the tech companies to change, but for us to take some responsibility on how we can make a change as well. You know, when you talk about our memories of that COVID map and watching as the cases came closer and closer to us, I can't help but shudder at thinking of all of the moms and dads who have begun to come forward to talk about their children who have died by suicide as a result of the experiences that they've had through social media. That number is increasing. It's happening everywhere. It's an equal opportunity issue. It's happening people from all backgrounds and cultures, and it's just the worst nightmare for anyone to think about when it comes to children. And by most reports, these are kids who are not experiencing vulnerabilities before, but had found themselves in situations that were so horribly traumatic and tragic for them, they felt that they had no choice. And I don't want for us to have to wait for that to happen more before people begin to recognize that they have the power to start setting limits in their own home.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Gaia, go ahead, and then Jim. Yeah.
And the reason I think the WHO could act quickly with the COVID pandemic, because it had emergency powers. So the question is, how does this problem fall under the WHO's emergency powers? For me, looking at a world of kids walking around like zombies is an emergency. However, I think for the world, the things that Mitch is talking about, the mental health crisis, is more likely to fall under the emergency scope of the WHO. So I think tying the two together is what's likely to lead us to more urgent action, which I think we need. And I know this is part of the topic of the panel, but we need to talk about how are we going to get to more comprehensive guidelines that will move this forward.
I think for that, measurability is very important, and I think what both the doctors here are saying is you put some numbers on it, assess the impact, look at the results of behavior change. I think those should go into feeding the regulation, because then it's an informed decision that we're making.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I will also just add, I think part of the problem is that this technology has sort of woven itself into the fabric of everyone's being. We've all drank the Kool-Aid, and part of why we're not registering, although it's beginning to happen, the effects on kids is because most of us have some level of addiction or attachment disorder, I think it's called. And as someone who's done numerous interventions, part of what has to happen is a group of people really wake the person up. There has to be a moment of real fear, and then you put in new information and you take them to treatment. But I really do believe that there needs to be some sort of, I would call it a radical, given how everybody is walking around now with their device, kind of paradigmatic shift about the focus is on protecting kids in their neurobiological development. We've seen that with cigarettes, with alcohol, with all those kinds of things. It needs to be framed within the same paradigm, that this is not anti-tech, it's protecting kids' health.
So how do we do that? I mean, Gaia, it sounds like you're about to jump in. I mean, I think we know it has to happen. What is it that sits in that gap between what we all know in our hearts, and even now a little bit more in our brains with some of the science, and getting some of that action to really happen?
Right, so following up on what Jim said, I think it's really important to define it in terms of harm. Most of these tech companies sit in the US. The US regulators are motivated mostly when they see harm, especially if it's economic harm. They're less motivated by the impact on human dignity or privacy. And I think there's this missing link here, because for some years we've had guidelines, but the guidelines, most of them are very narrow. So if you look at the American Pediatrics Association, they have screen time guidelines for kids up to 5. Now we know that these screens are affecting kids all the way to 18, they're affecting the cognitive development, they're affecting the mental health. What happened to the ages 5 to 18?
Right.
And then we got last year the Surgeon General advisory, which was very comprehensive and very strong. However, it only focused on social media. Now, I completely agree social media is a big issue, but it's not just social media. There seems to be trends here. We started by being focused on games, now we're focused on social media. But these addictive features are all over the internet, and something else will come next. So I think we need comprehensive guidelines which are not focused on low age, not focused on one specific type of apps, but are more comprehensive. And also, some of these guidelines, they talk mostly about what parents can do. And I, for one, think parents are quite powerless. I think the ones who need the guidelines most are schools, which need to decide how much to expose kids to screens in schools, and governments, because regulators will not regulate until they are sure that there is real harm that they are protecting kids against. And for that, I think we need really strong and comprehensive guidelines.
No, I think that's powerful, and I've heard this a couple of times this week, Gaia, is that we need to elevate different terminology, right? To frame this as harms, to frame this as a health issue, right? It's the World Health Organization, and they moved quickly because our health was at risk. Even bad parents, I don't think intentionally want to harm the health of their children. And maybe there's just a reframing here, that different terminology that is connected to solid science, which I think we're finally starting to see, might be part of that missing link, is a little bit of what I'm hearing there. Okay, good.
And I don't think parents are helpless. I don't mean to disagree,
No, it's
but
good. Yeah.
I think there's a way to, with some education, to empower them. And it's happened in every social change movement. I think that this is a similar paradigm of shifting at scale with an educational program and make parents aware, because if you have a 10-year-old and you knew that giving them a phone had the same effect as giving them cocaine, you wouldn't give them a phone until much later. I think that parallel may sound a little too harsh, but I think it has substantive value. So I don't, as a parent, I don't consider myself helpless. It takes enormous resolve, but knowing that I'm protecting my kids' future and their future self gives me the sort of strength to really go against the grain. At this point, hopefully in 5 years, the shift will have taken place.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to be more specific about what I said. I do
Sure.
think that parents of young children can do a lot because they have control. There's no reason for these parents to give their kids devices. But I did run an outreach program to parents and kids. That's how I started out. And what I saw was that once kids reach middle school, it becomes an endless fight between the parents and the kids, and the parents really want their kids back. They really want to change things, and they feel completely powerless. Why? Because the designs are addictive.
Right.
So that's what I meant about parents'
No,
powerless.
and I think,
go
go ahead.
I just
Pranjal.
want
Yeah.
to add to this point. Look, there was a while in European society, beer was given to kids, right? Beer soup was a thing because it was a food category. So, but you realize over time that it's not a great idea to give alcohol to kids because you establish the fact that there is harm to bodies. So that's point one. I think A, establishing harm, and B, letting parents know that this is a huge problem for their children. While they're investing a lot of money and effort into making sure that kids are safe and healthy, they give them the device as a palliative. In a flight, you will see kids there. I mean, in a pram, anywhere a kid is there with a young couple, they just want the kid to be on their own so that they can continue to be on the phone themselves.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But nobody has told those parents what a terrible harm it is inflicting on the kids, and nobody is telling them.
Right, and I think that the point of this, elevating it to that global conversation, maybe would empower more parents so that we change that cohort effect. I think what I hear from you, Gaia, isn't that parents are just weak. They feel powerless against forces in their own community where their child is the only one, right? And
No,
we
but
need to change.
sorry to interrupt you. I think a lot of parents don't know. It's not helpless are those who know but cannot do anything.
Okay.
But there are 500 million people or parents in the world who don't
just
even
simply
know
don't
that
know.
it is harmful.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the colas. We didn't know how much of sugar there was in it, and we had them like 3 times a day.
This is why the American Psychological Association put out its first ever health advisory on this topic. It had global reach. We were able to start that conversation. But the science is not reaching enough people.
Yeah. Yes.
That's just the beginning. And frankly, we're not able to do as much science as we would like. We also know that there are many scientific studies that have been done by tech companies, and they have not disclosed the results.
Right. That's right.
And I think that is critical for us to think about how do we make sure we are doing objective science to ensure that we have the facts about the harm. How are we disseminating that science out to everybody and doing it in a way that is appropriate for the culture or education level or values of all the different parts of the globe that we're talking about?
And Mitch, I actually read the report very carefully, and I read exactly the part you described right now, and that's what worried me. Because basically you're saying we cannot give you strong enough evidence because the tech companies won't give us access. That's exactly what they want. They're buying more time. And time is something we don't really have.
Right, right. So we need that so we can elevate the conversation to that global level so that we can bridge that I don't know gap, Pranjal, that you were just describing. And I think that's why it's so critical. You see how these layers must work together. It's not just one.
I also think that
just remember that
intuitively,
for a lot of people, getting a mobile device is the most exciting part of their life. Across the growing markets, right? Digital inclusion gets you the device. You never think about the harm it is inflicting.
I also just want to say, I think intuitively, the parents in the room, you wouldn't, even without knowing the science, let your kids watch porn or violence, right? Intuitively, there's a real clarity about how addictive these devices. How many of you have seen a 3-year-old throwing a tantrum, given a device, and instantly, it's a self-soothing thing, but it's through a device, not through a human. So I think we desperately need the science, but I think just on a purely intuitive level, we all know the power of these devices, and that needs to be amplified in a way that shifts some kind of narrative. Because as we all know, it took 30 years in the tobacco industry for, in the United States, the regulations really didn't come until Obama. In 1992, you had the heads of the tobacco industry lying through their teeth in front of Congress about that tobacco was not addictive nor was it dangerous. So to wait on these companies seems it's going to be a long way.
Yeah, there was a whistleblower in the case of tobacco, who actually said that there were chemicals being added to make it addictive.
More addictive.
Exactly what the content makers are doing.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah,
and
I'm
if
gonna.
you-
Could I shift us for a minute? I think we've stirred a little bit of good debate here, which is lovely. And I'd like to ask if we do have some time for questions. Margarita, why don't you jump in here for us first? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. What I would like to add here, first we are speaking about children, and I think because we are learning all the time, getting better and better. I think we have now to split children before 14 and children after 14. So children before 14 years old, we can speak, as we said already. I think that they should not be at all, because we cannot control anything. Tech industry can promise us whatever, but we know even if it will be not hard porno, it will be soft porno, doesn't matter. We cannot control, and this is why the shock for before 14 years old, we cannot afford to have it. So this is why I would say children before 14, they need this kind of regulation, and after 14, let's say until 18, they have, of course, then we can start to speak about contain. Because even if sometimes some accidents happens, maybe they are already strong enough. So this is why I would say we can say kids, let's say for the 14 years until 14, and then adolescents or something like that.
Sure.
Because many times it is kind of for people, especially for tech industry, this exactly they are using this.
That's right.
You know. So, but another thing what I want to say, I just had two interesting meetings. One, there were two guys from completely, they came to speak business. And I said, did you see around what is here written a little? They said, yeah, here a little, here, what's about? And then we started to speak about it, and they forgot about all business. They are two fathers.
Wow.
And they said, this is the most important conversation what we had. And of course, they will now not only checking what we are doing later, but they will spread this message.
Excellent.
And this, I had such conversations already, not for the first time, I have to say. People came to speak politics, or of course mainly business. And then when I opened a mouth about this, and everybody said to the end, this was the best conversation. Because in reality, this is what is the most important in our life, our children. So this was a good example. And then the second example, just happened here, there was a very active woman from UNESCO working with children, refugee around the globe, and with children, general different projects. She is a very determined to help children globally. And then she said to me, she shared a beautiful, exciting news from AI. They are preparing now, and they gave already kind of the first thing. Finally, there's a digital teacher. Children, they don't need to go to school. Children can see it in the front of this. This is an AI teacher, and she was so enthusiastically about this, speaking here in our lounge about this. Even didn't realize, and you know.
Where she was. That's
Exactly,
right.
exactly. And of course, she cares for the children, and she came here because we care for the children.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, when I started to speak with you a little, and we had only a few minutes before I came here, I gave you the example what I already said to you, like when before yesterday, when this tech industry guys came with a gadget for the children that the mother would, and I said to her, can you imagine these mothers losing their abilities, life skills, but if even worse, the children. And with this AI teachers, told them what you are speaking here about. So luckily for us, she was completely shocked, and she said, but it's a completely different story here where we are speaking now.
Yeah.
I said, yes, but we have to speak about it. Because now you are so enthusiastic about this gadget, and you are ready to spread it globally to all children.
Right.
No, but Margarita, it's maybe only for the children who have no teachers. I said, but this is exactly Machiavellic news from the tech industry. First, they want to help society. We don't have 44 million teachers are missing. Yes, we have these digital teachers. Please take it. But we know where it's going.
That's right.
So you have to think about it. You have to have somebody close to you who will remind you from these good wheels what is the real. And then, luckily for us, maybe she will come, by the way, this afternoon. She said, you know what? I have to sing now. I have to sing now everything what we are doing. So she left. So such conversations we need, of course. We need everywhere. But I would say we are not naive. We know. We just have conversation with also TikTok. And so these guys, they will fight back. And they are very strong. And they will not give us anything. They make a show like, YouTube, you know, let's ask this. But they will not do it freely. And we cannot wait until the regulation will really push them in the corner like in the tobacco industry. This is why I agree completely. Parents are in charge, but without school help, it will be very difficult. Yeah. We need to tackle the schools. And this is again parents. Who is going to we need, of course, from all of you, facts, and you have it luckily. We don't need to prove anymore, oh my God, this is toxic. No, it is, and by the way, as we speak, most of the parents, they don't know. I think, if honestly, this is a fault of the parents. Just open the internet, social media, and just write down what is the impact, and there's so much information. They don't want to do it. It's true, it's fine. We are all human beings. We want to have our comfort. But so with our big numbers, what is going on in the brain of the children, we have to wake them up. They have no right to be this comfortable. And then the parents will push the schools to react. This kind of
can I just respond to Margarita's brilliant point? But two facts I want to say. Today, the parents who are in their 20s have grown up with mobile phones. So for them, the concept of harm doesn't even exist because they have grown up with mobile phones, so they think it's absolutely fine.
But it doesn't work to speak with them because they will not understand. My hope is for the parents after 30. No, some genius already, these girls, this boy sitting here with 14 years old, he already knows the damage. This is our hope. But most of them, they don't. And with 20, my hope is for the parents after 30.
There are also new companies. There's a Chinese company. Everybody knows about TikTok being banned. India was the first country to ban TikTok. There's a new company called Baby Bus. Has anybody heard of Baby Bus? Look up Baby Bus. We are banning it because not only are they influencing children with terrible content, they're also stealing the data.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
Which is a very important aspect that we haven't thought of.
Yeah. Yeah. She does.
Like mushrooms.
It will. Yeah.
To abuse our children.
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go next over there.
Yeah, thank you
Could
so
you
much.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Angelica Shurgina. I am founder of a startup to help children to counter disinformation and cybersecurity threats, and I also am a disinformation researcher working a lot in science. So I'm very interested in this. All the topic was, this topic is so big that it will take a lot more time to discuss it properly. But a few things that I wanted to ask and to comment on. First, regulation. This is super important, and this is one of the most important practices. But did you even know, many people in this audience might have known, but for me, it was real shock when I found out at UNESCO conference that it takes 1 year to get the approval of a class book to schools, and there is no regulations around any tech solution that enters schools. So tech sector doesn't really have much accountability, and this is a big problem. So I think one of the biggest things that we can change is to hold them accountable. And another thing that it's really, really big threat, because now with an AI and with limitless possibilities and limitless risks, we can see the situation where, for example, ChatGPT can be used by teenagers, preteens, children, and they have a lot of information there that is not suited for them at all.
Correct.
So how do we change that? And for example, even in GPT guidelines, they say, okay, we have 13 years, like the age gap is 13, but how do you make sure that those kids are actually using it? And another thing that you've mentioned was about online threats that can come into offline violence, and that's offline threats. So if we talk about this as the global pandemic of disinformation as a threat to society at large, we need to look at those examples where this online harm resulted into offline harm for so many children. And those tech companies, they're hiding those numbers because they don't want it to be public. And for example, like UNICEF reports that 98% of children do not recognize fake news. They believe everything they see online. So how can we protect the generation at risk when AI is going to be predominant for this generation? That's a big question.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out a lot of different wonderful ideas there. We had a chance to talk, I think it was 2 nights ago, Angelica, about what you're working on, which is admirable. Thank you so much for what you're pouring into preventing that, educating them on how to identify that misinformation. So there were a number of different threads there, whether it's with accountability or holding tech companies to the same level, as you mentioned, textbooks, preventing some of that harm. Anybody want to jump in there?
Well, I think we live in a world in which we believe that technology will basically improve humanity. And that's the problem. That's why technology has no restrictions. And we also live in the idea that, drugs can affect our body, but technology cannot. We know this is not true anymore. So basically, but we have, for any drug, you have to go through many stages of approval. You don't have this for technology. I think we have to start thinking about technology in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. In other words, that before we experiment on humans with something that hasn't been vetted, let's put them through the same amount of rigor to ensure it's not going to do harm before it's released upon all of us. Yeah. Go ahead. Sir, over there, mind introducing yourself? I know we met earlier, so
yes,
thank you.
I'm Christian Horvath.
Christian, yes.
I'm co-founder of a startup from Zurich, and we are also partly working on the issue of how to communicate these complex topics like like the one we are discussing today, to a broader audience. So, so for that, I'm very grateful for all the great insights I got here. I would like to add like a high-level perspective, so a philosophical one, and would be very curious of what you think about that. So there's a Heidegger, I think, who said like every tool also changes the way you see the world. So for instance, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. So that's a famous kind of description of his theory. And I would be curious to hear your opinion on what do you think are the very high-level societal, global consequences of this excessive use of smartphones. In particular, to give you a context, I'm also very interested in like supporting democracy and establishing the necessary conditions for that. And so in this context, what do you think is the harm of this excessive use of this tool?
Christian, you just summarized, I believe, the entire sort of undercurrent of the human change house in the dehumanization and the risk that some of the democratic processes maybe are under because of it. So I think, excellent job. You didn't know that, but you just sort of summarized all that we've been discussing this week. Does anybody want to expand on that a little bit further in terms of maybe some of what could happen if we do nothing, I think is really the thread.
So in a nerd way, I'm going to try and tie in this issue of salience in terms of the brain stimulation. So part of why kids spend so much time on social media is because the algorithms drive them to darker and darker places that have more and more kind of lurid but stimulating appeal. And I think on a political level, you see that in terms of the hyperpolarization, the tribalism that's certainly happening in the United States. Nobody listens anymore. They go down their own silo, but they're getting charged all the time in a way that really almost prevents civil discourse.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think we'll go with one more question, and then, we'll go one and then two, and then we'll have plenty of time to discuss in the back. And we'll be good. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah,
Thank you.
My name is Lotta.
Hi, Lotta.
So my question goes back to kind of the global response, and the reality is that a lot of the research, as you mentioned, is done, whether that's in North America or in OECD countries, but within the next few decades, that won't be the majority of the youth globally. So, I mean, for example, by 2050, they're estimating that 35% of the global youth is from Africa alone. How do we make sure that how can we approach the concept of these suggested regulations or policy recommendations that they're created for the global majority, and so that they're not created for the global minority, and then the global majority have to try to make those work, locally. I know we talked about local, big proponent of local solutions, but we do need those global guidelines on how to then approach that from a local perspective.
Yeah, Mitch, go ahead.
Absolutely. It's an incredibly important point. We are doing research in a variety of different locations now around the globe. And one of the things that becomes so critical when doing so is that we do not import our North American ideas, constructs, approaches, and impose them upon other cultures or regions and ask whether it fits our preconceived notions, but rather good global research is really starting from a more ethnographic perspective of trying to understand what are the values, what are the practices, what are the behaviors as defined within that community, and really to learn how to assess those issues from that perspective. And good global research or cross-cultural research is really not about imperialism, but instead of listening and thinking about the diversity of solutions that fit each context.
Right. So it's a broad table, right? Wide table to have that conversation. Yeah, good. Yeah, please.
My name is Gino Yu. I'm a professor in Hong Kong. I used to teach at USC. I founded the multimedia program in the engineering school there. I've been in digital entertainment for about 30 years. But the last 15, 20 years has been focused in the area of consciousness, understanding phenomenology and neurophysiology. And so a lot of the things that are happening in social media right now, we've already seen 20 years ago in video games. And so in terms of the regulation of video games, in our lab, what we do is we look at kind of the mind-body relationship as well too. And from the perspective of the physiology and the cells in your body, video games and social media, all that's happening is you're throttling the autonomic nervous system and you're getting a hit of dopamine every now and then. You know, that's the perspective from the body. But there's also, for us, a move towards looking at developmental psychology as well, too. And so this is very important. We talked about the different ages before 14 and after 14, and we know that after 14, it was interesting, Margarita pointed that out, because they have to kill their parents psychologically to become their own person as well, too. And so anything you try to impose, they're going to fight that. And that age is getting kind of younger and younger with all of this. And so there are a lot of challenges with this. And there's an understanding, though, that with developmental psychology, that people are developing in a certain way. If you're familiar with integral theory and everything, and all of that is being accelerated. And so in a sense, once you know where a person's at, they can't stay there forever. They're also evolving and developing. And so factoring all of those things into this is important, giving them a route out. You know, so they've done this, you know, and the violence and everything, the desire and all of this other stuff, that's not, the soul, in a sense, knows that that's not sustainable. It's going to find another way. And so there are opportunities through that. And so looking at, I'm suggesting more positive ways of understanding that it is a stage of development, and then how do we then move them along. Other areas that's really good at, I haven't really heard about, you guys talk about yet too, is the area of mindfulness. And we know that when you're present, and if you look at emotional intelligence, these things are also very important too. And if you bring yourself fully present, and you can use games and everything to cultivate mindfulness as well too, but mindfulness combats the addiction of social media, because it keeps you back into your body and it brings you to, you know, your physiological, and now with biometrics of being aware of breath and being aware of biometrics correlated to emotional state, that's a very important thing that these technologies can also develop, that also enhance this and help move people along in their development.
Well, you've provided a number of different ideas and solutions, ways to integrate, really to broaden this, and I hope that that carries us then into some conversations that we can have.
So the best way for mindfulness is to do yoga every day.
Yeah.
All aspects of yoga, and especially for yoga for kids. And that's happening across many colleges and schools.
Thank you. Yeah, we need to wrap things up, and we've got some time to hang out and talk in the back. But let's give a round of applause to our panel here. Thank you so much. Yeah. Obviously a big topic, a lot to talk about, so let's continue the conversation. Thank you.